The Great Smoky Mountains are more than a national park. They're a living archive, a place where the fog doesn't just roll in to hide the peaks, but drifts low and slow to veil whatever was left behind. Out here, every trail has a name. Every ridge has a story. And some of those stories never really ended. For over a century, hikers, rangers, even entire search parties have simply vanished in this wilderness. Gone in clear weather, in broad daylight, sometimes only a few steps from help. Files were opened, reports were written, and then quietly closed. Not because the truth was found, but because people stopped asking the questions. The Smokies keep their records differently. You can hear it in the silence before dawn, when the air feels heavier than it should. You can feel it in the soil, rich, cold, like a ground that doesn't just grow trees, but buries evidence. Officials say these mountains are unpredictable. Locals say they're selective. Because once you step past the tree line here, it's not just about where you go. It's about whether the mountains decide you leave. So, lock your doors, put on your headphones, because after this video, you'll never look at the Great Smoky Mountains the same way again. And it starts with one woman on one familiar trail who walked into the woods and never came back. It was supposed to be an easy walk, the kind you barely plan, because you've done it so many times it feels more like a habit than a hike. On September 20th, 1981, 8-year-old Thelma Pauline Melton joined two close friends for a light afternoon stroll along the Deep Creek Trail. She knew that path by heart. She had walked it for years, every summer, like a ritual the mountains and she shared in private. The weather was clear, the terrain gentle, no storm clouds, no warnings, no reason at all to be afraid. Around late afternoon, near the crest of the loop, the group began ascending a mild incline. Nothing strenuous, nothing unusual. Witnesses say Thelma was smiling, chatting, just a few steps ahead of her friends on the narrow path. One moment she was there, her voice drifting back through the trees. The next, she wasn't. There was no scream, no sound of slipping rocks, no crash through underbrush. She was simply gone, as if the trees had closed ranks around her and decided not to open again. Her friends called her name, at first laughing, thinking she'd stepped behind a tree or rounded a bend. The laughter didn't last long. For nearly an hour, they searched on their own, walking back and forth along the trail, scanning the woods on either side. Finally, shaken and panicked, they alerted the rangers. Within 2 hours, the park launched a full-scale operation. Helicopters swept the area from above. More than 100 volunteers and rangers combed the ground in tight formation. Scent dogs were brought in, noses down, pulling hard on their leads. At first, the dogs caught her trail. They followed it confidently, until they didn't. Mid-path, where the ground should have been just as scuffed and worn as anywhere else, the scent simply stopped. The dirt ahead was smooth, undisturbed, as if nothing and no one had passed that way in days. Search teams fanned out in grids, pushing deeper into the woods, checking every possible exit. Nothing. No footwear impressions in the soft soil, no broken branches, no scraps of fabric, no purse, no bottle, no sign of a struggle. Rangers checked nearby motels and roads in case Thelma had become disoriented and wandered out of the park. They found nothing there either. Her husband confirmed what they already feared. Thelma hadn't been carrying identification, money, or medication. Just a bottle of water, her easy smile, and the expectation of a walk that should have lasted less than an hour. By the second week, something changed. The search dogs, eager at first, began balking at the edge of the woods. Handlers described them as spooked by something invisible, refusing to re-enter the same forest they'd crossed a dozen times before. Eventually, the operation wound down. The final report listed her as presumed deceased, though no body was ever found. Officially, the case faded quietly into park history. Unofficially, it only grew darker. Campers near Deep Creek later reported faint cries echoing from the trees around dusk, a woman's voice repeating a single word no one could quite make out. Some swore she was calling home. Others heard, "Help." In 2001, a ranger patrolling after hours saw a figure standing motionless on the trail. A woman in beige, the same color outfit Thelma had been wearing the day she vanished. When he blinked, she was gone. His flashlight beam swept the dirt where she'd been standing. No footprints. Thelma's family never received closure. Her husband died years later, believing she'd been taken suddenly, not by a person, not by an accident, but by the mountains themselves. And though the park still calls it a disappearance, those who hike Deep Creek after sunset feel something else, a subtle pull, like the air tightening around your chest. Because when someone vanishes without sound, sometimes it's the mountain answering a question no one thought to ask. Deep Creek isn't the only place where the Smokies seem to hold on to what should have moved on. Sometimes they don't take people, they take light, and they trap it in the last place you'd expect, a church. Cades Cove is one of the most photographed valleys in America, a wide, quiet loop of old pioneer cabins, split-rail fences, and 3 historic churches that sit like ghosts from another century. During the day, it's a postcard. Sun on the fields, tourists on bicycles, deer drifting between the trees. But at night, one of those churches doesn't stay as empty as it looks. The primitive Baptist church stands near the old loop road, its white clapboard walls weathered, its small graveyard sinking slowly into the earth. The building has been closed since the early 1942, its doors nailed shut after the congregation disbanded. No services, no weddings, no candles burning on Sunday mornings. And yet, starting in the mid-1950s, rangers and visitors began reporting something strange, pale lights, flickering inside the church windows long after dark. At first, it was easy to laugh off. People said locals must be sneaking in with lanterns. Others blamed car headlights from the loop road, bouncing and bending through the glass. In a place that old, people expect a story, and sometimes they're quick to invent one. But then came the photographs. In 1959, a tourist snapped a routine shot of the church at dusk with a simple Kodak camera. When the film was developed, the picture showed more than wood and glass. Inside the sanctuary, hanging mid-air, was a soft, glowing sphere of light. Not a beam, not a flare from the lens. It reflected on no surface. It cast no shadow. It looked like it was shining from within the photo itself, as if the film had recorded something the eye hadn't fully seen. By the 1970s, the reports were frequent enough that the park stopped laughing. Motion sensors and cameras were installed around the church. If pranksters were sneaking in, the equipment would catch them. Instead, the footage caught something else, a faint, drifting illumination inside the locked sanctuary. It moved from pew to pew, lingering as if pausing by invisible faces, then sliding toward the pulpit before quietly fading out. No doors opened. No heat signatures appeared. One ranger who reviewed the tapes described it as light searching for something it can't find. Locals tie the first sightings to a small burial relocation project in 1941, when graves near the church were moved to make way for the new loop road. Many of the headstones were unnumbered. Some markers were lost completely. According to the stories, the light in the church isn't random at all. It follows the missing names. In 1992, a storm tore a shutter loose, leaving a narrow line of sight into the barred sanctuary. A maintenance worker, checking the damage at dusk, made the mistake of looking in. He claimed he saw it, a concentrated glow floating through the nave, pulsing softly, like liquid fire that didn't need air to burn. The next morning, when he and another ranger opened the door to survey the interior, they found no lantern, no wires, nothing that could have produced the light. But the interior walls near the front were marked with darkened streaks, subtle scorch patterns that, from the right angle, resembled overlapping handprints. Officially, the National Park Service blames atmospheric refraction, humidity, and residual heat trapped in old glass and wood. Unofficially, the people who've seen it know better. The light doesn't flare up and vanish like a trick of the eye. It moves with intent. Sometimes, witnesses say, it aligns perfectly with the rows of pews, as though pacing them, retracing a service that never ended. The church remains sealed, its doors still nailed shut. But if you walk the Cades Cove loop at dusk and glance toward the primitive Baptist church, you might see it. A soft, steady glow pulsing just behind the boards. Maybe it's energy. Maybe it's memory. Or maybe it's what happens when faith refuses to leave even after the people do. And if the light can still move freely inside a house meant for the lost and the faithful, you have to wonder, what happens when it decides to step outside those walls and follow you into the trees? The Smokies don't just hold on to light. Sometimes, They give things back, but the way they return them is never simple and never kind. 18 years after Thelma Melton vanished on Deep Creek Trail, that same corner of the mountains made the news again. This time, it wasn't for someone who disappeared. It was for someone who came back in a way that made no sense at all. In July of 1999, a 28-year-old man named Travis Bennett arrived at the park with friends for a summer camping trip. They set up near Deep Creek, along a stretch of water so tame most people think of it as a place for wading, not for danger. Shallow, clear, barely chest deep in most spots. Families bring kids there. They float on inner tubes. It's not the kind of place where you expect to die. One evening, just before dinner, Travis told his friends he was going to cool off with a quick swim. The air was warm, the current calm. They watched him walk toward the water, and that was the last time they saw him alive. When he didn't come back, they searched the banks, calling his name, expecting to find him splashing or sitting on a rock somewhere downstream. He wasn't. 3 days later, rangers found his body lodged against a fallen log in the creek, only a few miles from where Thelma had vanished on land. At first glance, it looked like a tragic but ordinary drowning. People slip, hit their head, the water takes them. That's how the story usually goes. But the details at the scene didn't match that easy explanation. First, his clothes weren't scattered or soaked. They were folded, neatly. Each item of clothing, pants, shirt, shoes, was stacked on the bank as if someone had taken the time to arrange them. The fabric was clean and dry. On top of the stack sat his watch, still ticking. Second, the body itself was wrong for a drowning. Travis was found facing upstream. Against the current, his body pressed toward the flow instead of carried by it. There were no obvious scrapes, no bruises on the rocks where he should have been tossed or dragged. The coroner's report noted something even more unsettling. There was no significant water in his lungs. Whatever killed him, it did not look like a conventional drowning. His official cause of death, undetermined. The park's incident log showed something else. Search teams had covered that same section of creek twice before his body appeared there. Both sweeps were thorough. Both times, there was nothing. One ranger, years later, put it in simple, uneasy words. He wasn't there, and then he was. As investigators tried to piece it together, another layer of strangeness surfaced, this time in the numbers. Sensors downstream recorded a short, sharp anomaly in the water's movement for that week. For 31 seconds, during the approximate window Travis went missing, the creek's flow slowed, paused, and then briefly surged backward before returning to normal. The event was logged as a technical glitch. No one ever explained it. Today, the Deep Creek Trail is still open. In summer, you can see children splashing and families laughing near the bend where Bennett was found. Most leave with nothing more than damp shoes and a few photos, but some visitors notice something else when the water goes still. The sound of splashing, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from the upstream shallows where no one is standing. Locals shrug and blame it on stones in the current. People who've heard it up close say otherwise. It doesn't sound like water hitting rock. It sounds like footsteps, pacing just below the surface. On Deep Creek, a woman can step ahead on the trail and never be seen again. A man can vanish from calm water and reappear where he shouldn't, facing the current, lungs nearly dry, as if the river itself changed its mind. If the flow can turn against itself for half a minute, what else in these mountains might decide to change direction? Maybe the Smokies don't just erase. Maybe sometimes they edit. If Deep Creek shows how water can disobey its own rules, another valley in the Smokies suggests that sound can do the same. By the time the 2010 seconds rolled around, the Great Smoky Mountains weren't just a tourist destination. They had become one of the most acoustically studied parks in America. The goal was simple: understand the noise. Where animals move. How far car engines echo. How quiet the wilderness really is when humans step back. Deep in a dense, restricted valley often called Tremont, banks of sensitive microphones were hidden in trees and on ridgelines. They listened day and night, recording the whispers of wind, the chorus of insects, the far-off murmur of streams. For months, the data was boring in exactly the way scientists like: predictable, natural, easy to categorize. Then, one night in March, at 2:14 a.m., the valley didn't sound like a valley anymore. The sensors began transmitting something that shouldn't have been there. Human voices. Not conversation, not shouts for help. A low, rhythmic chant. The nearest public trail was more than 6 miles away. The area around the microphones was off limits, with no campsites, no cabins, no reason for anyone to be there. Thermal scans later showed no lights, no campfires, no heat signatures, yet on the recordings, the sound was clear and growing closer, as if a group was moving through the trees. For 8 minutes, the chant rose and fell. There were no distinct words, at least not in any language the technicians immediately recognized. It wasn't radio static either. It had the breath patterns of human speech, the rise and fall of people inhaling and exhaling in unison. And then, mid-syllable, it stopped. Not faded, stopped. Rangers hiked into the area at first light. The ground around the sensor stations was undisturbed. No boot prints, no discarded gear, no signs of trespass. It was as if the voices had never existed anywhere except inside the recordings. The audio was sent to the Tremont Institute's research director, Dr. Evan Rhodes. In a later interview, he described it carefully, like a man stepping around something he couldn't fully explain. Linguistically structured, he said, but not identifiable as any known language. Spectrogram analysis showed tonal breaks like those created by human lungs, but here they were layered across multiple frequencies, as if several voices were speaking at the exact same time in perfect unison. Officially, the National Park Service filed it under anomalous interference. Unofficially, copies of the track began to circulate among sound technicians and researchers, passed from hard drive to hard drive like contraband. One engineer, curious and maybe a little too brave, slowed the recording to 1/4 speed. Beneath the chant, under the swell of layered tones, he swore he heard another voice. Faint, cutting through like a whisper beneath a storm. We are beneath. Skeptics called it pareidolia, the same trick of the mind that lets people see faces in clouds. Maybe, they said, the brain was forcing meaning onto random sound, but even they struggled to explain one detail. On that same night, at exactly 2:14 a.m., seismic instruments in the Tremont Valley registered a subtle tremor, just enough to make the ground shiver. The microphones should have distorted with the vibration. Instead, the chant shifted with it, its pitch bending in sync with the earth, as if it had been waiting for the movement. Soon after, the park ordered all acoustic sensors in that sector removed. The files were locked behind restricted classifications. Public records were padded with harmless, environmental test entries, placeholders where the real data used to be. Still, the people who worked on the project insist something changed in Tremont after that night. Birdsong patterns altered, as if certain calls no longer crossed the valley. Coyotes stopped howling near particular ridges, and on still evenings, if you stand in the right place with a portable speaker and play white noise, some claim you can hear a faint echo threading through it. Not loud, almost polite, like something repeating what we already said from somewhere we can't reach. The mountains, it seems, aren't just recording us. They might be rehearsing, practicing our voices, testing what it sounds like when the land itself speaks back. And Tremont isn't the only place where the Smokies blur the line between watcher and watched. Long before the censors, long before the leaked files, there was another group sent into the fog, a search party of rangers who went looking for the lost and became a mystery themselves. The year was 1940, just 6 years after the Smokies were officially declared a national park. Back then, the roads were more mud than pavement. The cabins still smelled of fresh timber and coal smoke. Rangers weren't just paper pushers, they were explorers with badges, walking into territory that had only recently shifted from private hands to federal land. The maps were rough. The rules were new. The mountains, however, were the same as they'd always been. That October, a small group of tourists was reported missing near the Forney Ridge area. 3 adults, 2 children, last seen hiking toward Klingman's Dome. They never checked back in. No one saw them leave the park. Their car waited in the lot, as if they'd only stepped away for an hour. The park assembled a search team of 3 rangers. John Moorfield, a quiet veteran, Henry Blevins, known for his navigation skills, and their field lead, Joseph Wallace. They left at sunrise with packs, lanterns, and revolvers, following the ridgeline into a fog that was already starting to thicken. They were supposed to sweep the route, locate any sign of the family, and radio back by nightfall. Only one of them came back. Moorfield was found about 30 hours later near Noland Creek, more than 10 miles from where he'd started. He was dehydrated, disoriented, and barefoot. His boots were gone, His pack was gone. His lantern was gone. He couldn't explain how he'd crossed miles of dense forest and rough terrain in the dark, with no food, no light, and no shoes. His feet were cut and torn, but not as badly as they should have been. In interviews, his statements were fragmented, broken by long pauses and sudden tremors. He talked about voices in the fog, voices that sounded close, then far, then close again without ever revealing a source. He described seeing lantern light through the trees, always just ahead, bobbing like someone was waving him forward. But no matter how fast he moved, he never caught up. The strangest thing he said wasn't about what he saw, but what he heard. He told investigators there was a noise following them, not an echo, not something repeating their sounds, a noise that moved with them, but just out of sight, as if the forest itself was pacing at their backs. Throughout all the transcripts, one phrase appeared every time he managed to hold his thoughts together. We weren't the ones being followed. The missing tourists were never found. Neither were Blevins or Wallace. Their trail markers led searchers to a small clearing near Forney Creek, where the ground looked disturbed, churned as though something heavy had been dragged or buried there recently. No bodies were recovered, no gear, no obvious sign of a fight, just a patch of earth that didn't look like the rest. The official explanation blamed exhaustion, exposure, and disorientation. Moorfield was eventually transferred to a veterans hospital in Knoxville and never returned to active duty. On paper, the case faded into the growing stack of early park tragedies, but the mountains didn't forget. In 1976, park archaeologists surveying the same region uncovered fragments of canvas, rusted belt buckles, and 2 revolvers in that clearing. Serial numbers confirmed that one of the guns had belonged to Ranger Blevins. The discovery was noted, logged as historic artifact recovery, and quietly sealed. No further excavation was authorized. Decades later, on his deathbed in a VA hospital in Nashville, Moorfield reportedly began murmuring names. The missing tourists, his fellow rangers. Then, with a clarity that unsettled the nurse at his side, he whispered, "They're still walking the ridge. I verily." In 2010, a group of backcountry hikers camping near that same area reported hearing a whistle cut through the fog in the early hours of the morning. 3 short notes repeated a pattern that matches the ranger distress signal still taught today. When one of them instinctively whistled the pattern back, the reply came almost instantly. But it didn't come from the direction they'd heard it first. It came from somewhere no person could have stood without crashing through dense brush. That section of the park has never been reopened for night access. Rangers who patrol nearby sometimes report the sensation of footsteps in sync with their own, just beyond the reach of their lantern light, stopping the moment they turn around. If the forest can remember the missing, it may not simply hold them, it may keep them walking. And somewhere beyond the documented trails, the Smokies may be running their own search parties looking for what's lost and deciding what to give back. By the mid-1970s, the Smokies had already gathered a long list of missing names and unanswered questions. Some vanished on trails, some in rivers, some in the fog between ridges. But one story suggests the mountains might not just keep what they take, they might also store it, piece by piece, somewhere out of sight. In the fall of 1976, 2 hunters from Bryson City headed deep into the backcountry near the old Proctor logging site. Before Fontana Lake swallowed it in the 1942, Proctor had been a busy little town. Now, all that remained were a few scattered ruins and the quiet weight of water over what used to be streets. The men were tracking deer through thick forest when they saw something that shouldn't have been there at all. At the edge of a small clearing, half hidden by pine and laurel, stood a cabin, not a ruin, not a collapsed shack, a small, perfectly intact structure that didn't appear on any park map they knew. Its boards were dry and straight, unwarped by decades of rain. The roof sat tight, the doorway was square. Yet the style of the build looked older than the park itself, like something from another time that had never had the chance to rot. As they stepped into the clearing, the sound of the forest changed. The usual hum of insects and rustle of leaves seemed to dim, as if someone had turned down the volume. The air felt heavier, thick and muffled, like a room with too much insulation. Inside, the cabin was almost empty. No bed, no stove, no signs anyone was living there. Dust coated the floor and walls in an even gray film except for one place, A long wooden table sat in the center of the room, and on it lay a neatly arranged collection. A kerosene lantern, a stack of hand-drawn maps of the Smokies marked with small red circles, and several small boxes. Each box contained fragments of human bone. Every fragment was tagged, labeled, and numbered in a tight, precise handwriting. Next to the boxes lay a notebook, open to a page with a simple heading, "Recovered, 14 unidentified." The hunters left. Quickly, they marked the location carefully and went straight to the park authorities. The next morning, rangers followed their coordinates back into the woods. The clearing was there. The cabin was not. No timbers, no foundation, no broken glass. The grass grew flat where the walls should have stood, and the soil felt loose and recently disturbed, as though something large had been removed overnight. But there were no drag marks, no tire tracks, nothing. Rumors spread quietly among rangers for months. Some said the cabin belonged to an obsessed anthropologist digging without permission. Others whispered about a government project, a secret recovery effort with no paperwork. But no official records showed any sanctioned excavation there. Not in 1976. Not before. Not after. A year later, one of the hunters received an unmarked envelope. Inside was a single Polaroid photograph. His cabin stood in the frame, unmistakable, but shot from a different angle than he remembered. On the back, in the same neat handwriting that had labeled the bones, were 7 words, "We only took what the mountain gave back." The photo was handed over to the authorities, logged as unverified material, and sealed away. It has never been made public. Since then, hikers near the old Proctor area have reported hearing a pattern deep in the woods. 3 sharp knocks, a pause, then 3 more. It echoes, directionless, fading before anyone can trace it. Old-timers say the rhythm matches an old ranger signal, meaning site located. The park has never confirmed a single official recovery from that area. 6 stories, 6 pieces of evidence the mountains were never meant to keep, but did. A woman, Thelma Melton, gone between heartbeats on a clear, familiar trail. A church that glows from within long after its doors were nailed shut. A man found facing the current, clothes folded, lungs nearly dry. A recording of voices where no one can walk, chanting in a language no one knows. Rangers who followed the lost and became footsteps in the fog. And a cabin that appears just long enough to return what the earth has already claimed. Each story ends the same way, not with answers, but with silence. Because in the Great Smoky Mountains, silence isn't the absence of sound. It's a choice. The park doesn't bury its secrets only in soil. It archives them in the air, in stone, in water that never stops moving. And sometimes, if you listen long enough, it feels like the mountains are still taking attendance. 6 mysteries. 6 files left open in the dark. If you made it this far, thank you. Leave a like if one of these stories stayed with you. Tell us in the comments which mystery haunts you most and which mountains we should explore next. Just remember, the Smokies don't just hide what's missing, they decide who gets to leave.